it really created no incentive or
So I can cut down this forest and get permission to mine by just giving you money, which you then in the Indian context put in CAMPA, that compensates afforestation, which is not used.
give you 60, 70, 80,000 crores sitting
in CAMPA funds.
Cash sitting where you once had forest. And how are we going to convert that to forests?
Welcome back to the 4th episode of Conservation in the Middle, where we talk about a number of issues, including and centering power, knowledge, and the economy. And in this episode, we're going to talk much more about the role of the market and the idea, as we've been talking about it, problematizing the idea of selling nature to save it. How has conservation today become a practice so shaped by the market? What are the pros and cons of this, and where can we go forward? But Rohan, first to begin, where did the whole idea of the markets enter conservation?
So, I suppose the markets, as we talked about earlier as well, go to sustainable development narratives, have always been there as part of the conservation in the big years. The market has always been trying to enter this. But I suspect that at some point, conservationists were really disquieted by the idea that these are production landscapes, etc., and we need to, and many biologists began to think that perhaps what we need to do, rather than trying to have justification that say that an ecosystem is worth, a species is valuable in its own right, etc. Why don't we actually use economic instruments to try to figure out how much of that? And perhaps that's the reason why people might not want to conserve things, because they don't exactly know.
Understand the value
they
of
don't
things.
They don't understand the value of it. And so if only we could put a value on every species or everything that happens within an ecosystem and show, make evident, lay bare exactly what an ecosystem provides to the world, right? Then the market mechanisms themselves would make it self-evident that you need to conserve this. And I think that's the underlying philosophy with which, you have much of the evaluation making. And so you have, in studying ecosystems, you understand that that it's not merely, there are species, of course, and then you have the relationships between species. And that translates into a whole bunch of ecosystem functions. At least there are a whole bunch of critical functions that ecosystems do in order to maintain themselves more or less. Now, if you take the idea of the ecosystem function and you can translate that into a service that the function is providing.
For instance, hydrology translates into the amount of groundwater that's in the ground, or leaves photosynthesis translates into pollution,
carbon capture,
or pollination. All of these things are, and then if you work that through, you can actually say, okay, hang on, but pollination is a service that farmers require for keeping their crops in production and all the rest of it, and I can therefore value it. Can therefore take that ecosystem service, and therefore I can say, if this was taken to the marketplace, how much would the market be willing to pay for this?
And this would help me give an economic logic to protect the forest, where the bees are there.
Yeah,
where
the bees are providing a service,
yeah,
like pretty much all the service providers, right? And so Bob Costanza in the 1990s basically talks about how you can actually value all of it. Eventually, they came up with an initial estimate, which is something like
35 trillion.
13 trillion, which is then upward to the aspect. All of nature, if you put some broad numbers to it, is worth $13 trillion per year or something like that. And that seemed like a really big number. And you felt, okay, that this is something that's worth what should be worth conserving, just for the services they provide. And I think that's where the idea of to some extent, that's when it opened up the doors for this whole idea of valuation. It became a very powerful idea.
I might add to that. I mean, that's a kind of reasoned strategy by which one can kind of reimagine and reframe nature as something that is inherently generating values that are not getting incorporated into the larger economic calculus. And here is a way of visibilizing that economic value that's being generated. So that's on the one hand a much more strategic way of reframing. But I think there's also, for the conservationist on the ground, there was a much more tactical reason. There were certain kind of challenges that the conservationists could address, because ultimately in the real world, addressing a challenge involved the application of power and so on to bring about a change. So if there were people who were residing in a park you wanted to enclose, you could move them out. That you could do. But if there was someone who was willing to come and take half your park out because they wanted to mine there, or they wanted to develop parts of those areas, you found yourself far less powerful than the people furthering those interests. So what would you do then? So you really had to be able to push back against someone more powerful than you. So I think there was also a tactical reason why a more strategic reframing of this sort became more and more incorporated into the conservationist toolkit.
I've used it myself so many times in Bangalore. People are cutting trees and they come to us saying, "You're a university, talk about tell the court, give us a report which is an independent environmental impact assessment so we can take it to the courts." And one of the things they always ask us to do is an economic valuation. If you cut down a tree, yes, you get this road or this metro or whatever other infrastructure that's important to Bangalore's economy. But what is the loss of the tree doing in terms of ecosystem services? And that's a very powerful argument that the court would take. So operationally, tactically, we use it. Intellectually or normatively, I'm very troubled by it, because it's almost saying that this tree has value because only because it provides these services.
But also look at it from the other side. See, this is not even half the work done for it to be actually become valuable. When does in a market something, not just by putting a price. First of all, it has to be something which somebody has been willing to pay money for.
Exactly. You putting a price doesn't help.
The market economy pay for something. When we go to the market, when there is a clearly defined commodity which can be transacted. Now, even when it comes to nature, I think these kind of, why you can use these calculations and actually there is a lot, increasingly lost in translation as you keep going from the local level of a tree and its cost of timber, from a timber to right up to the planetary scale. I think there's enormous amount. So let's stay with that abstraction, and lost in that. Let's not even talk about that. But is this enough? Increasingly, people realize that that is not enough. That just putting a value is not going to draw the market to it. You have to figure out a way to monetize this, to transform this value into a transactable commodity. And that's where the rubber starts hitting the road.
I think there's also been conceptually, when you start looking at it, I mean, we've looked at the conceptual idea of a protected area, the conceptual idea of sustainable development, and similarly here, markets as being the ways of an allocation mechanism, whereby something that is really in danger, as parts of nature are, that you can use these pricing mechanisms and economic instruments to create and design incentives and disincentives by which you can regulate how society and the economy relates to it. The good example is our own experience with the net present value with forests. So we defined what a forest is, and then we put a committee of economists to come in and tell us what a hectare of forest is worth. And they said if it's a closed forest, it's worth this much. If it's an open forest, it's worth this much. And then under directions of a court, we went ahead and implemented it. And then we started. So the whole idea, and in the reasoning behind it, the idea was to make it expensive to destroy forests. But what it eventually did, putting an abysmally low value of between 6 and 11 lakh per hectare of forest, what it did was essentially create a small additional cost to business it really created no incentive or disincentive.
I can cut down this forest and get permission to mine by just giving you money, which you then, in the Indian context, put in CAMPA, the compensatory afforestation, which is not used.
I'll give you 60, 70, 80,000 crores sitting
in CAMPA funds.
In cash, sitting where you once had forests. And how are we going to convert that to forests? And functionally,
we've been studying the accretion potential of coral reefs, right? We're trying to take it in coral atolls, low like coral atoll. It is very, very critical to maintain these systems as being habitable, to have this barrier of coral that are growing and constantly repairing itself, etc. That's a very, very valuable service that the corals provide to low-lying coral atolls against storms and climate change and all the rest. So over the last several years, what we've been measuring is the amount of calcium carbonate that we produce per year in streams. And so one day, at the back of the envelope, I was just basically trying to see how much would this actually cost? The service of calcium accretion, calcium carbonate accretion. And once I did the calculation, when I tried to look at the price of JK cement, I quickly put that calculation away because cement is so cheap that
the cost of the coral
the cost of the coral works
as cement. Yeah,
absolutely.
By the way, that's the kind of evaluations people use.
Right.
They use comparative kind of.
And I think that when you go down that path, you realize that there's such a lot that's lost. Right? If you just think of this in terms of bags of cement, if you think about a coral as just a whole lot of bags of cement, of course it will work out with that. But there's such a lot else.
What a travesty it would be to think of it.
Right. I mean, there's all these other architectural complexity, the diversity, all these other functions that it's very, very difficult to put into a balance sheet. And of course, in the field, there is the field of ecological economics has understood this. I mean, it has tried to revise its valuation.
Yeah, I think so. But I think we should also be mindful of the fact that the ecological economics discipline itself has multiple intellectual traditions. So if you look at the Costanza kind of guys who are trying to really, like you said, tactically and strategically trying to position and responding to a natural crisis in the 80s, 90s, then what language do we speak to make people recognize this? Because there is this entire discourse of global development. Like we said, there's a larger idea of market-oriented development, which is how do we make this legible?
And it's very compelling. It is
compelling.
Value is extremely
but here
compelling.
Is the thing, right? But there is also another tradition in ecological economics, the Nicholas, Georges Rogan kind of approach, where you think of the economy itself as a biophysical entity, constrained by. So that is a more explicit incorporation of ecology as a biophysical set of, not just as a constraint, as a sort of embedding.
Saying that economy is embedded in ecology, not the other way around.
Right? So that's a very different conception. Whereas here, the premise on which we are operating today is we have this possibility of infinite growth.
Yeah, it's the unbounded nature of the economy.
Exactly. So which is the whole idea, right? Today's idea of economics is largely drawn from an area that price and the supply-demand kind of dynamics, price is the right kind of signal, and there is the supply-demand kind of dynamic. Broadly, I'm caricaturing of something much more complex in the constraint of time, but broadly, that's the hubris, right? That can fully address it. And then, of course, associated with is an idea of private property and all of those regimes, which are part and parcel of a larger package deal. The abstractions that you need to go through and the kind of force fitting that you need to do of what ecological entities are and ecological processes are to arrive at something which is easily commoditizable and lends itself to the dynamic of the market is where the biggest violence is.
And to me, the biggest danger is in fact not in ecosystems, but like we were discussing just before we started this, on carbon credits. Because the whole idea, when you take it to the other planetary crisis of climate change, we talked about Campa and we talked about the compensatory forestation, so you can cut down a forest and pay for it. But you can do completely damaging, you can be an oil and natural gas company and pay for carbon credits for what? And we've seen, there have been exposes by The Guardian and other news agencies that talk about the fact that in fact, I think they had some number, if I remember correctly, 90% of the world's carbon credit projects were all exposed to be fraud. Where you said that there were forestry growing, there are no forestry.
It's also, once you go down that path, it's also not even clear that this whole idea of carbon sequestration is right. You don't even know how much different ecosystems or species actually contribute to. And so we're doing very, very rough science, and the science trying to catch up with this. And when for instance, with sea glass levels, which is a typical example, lots of studies that were saying that sea glass meadows were able to sequester the most amount of carbon of all the ecosystems apart from wetlands and stuff like that. But many of them, if you actually start taking a look at them, many of those calculations stem from a few studies that have been done in some of the longest sea glass meadows in the world. So things like Posidonia oceanica meadows and things like that. But most sea glass meadows across the world are not Posidonia oceanica meadows. They are meadows that are highly dynamic, short-lived species that change from year to year. And if you look at those, particularly if you look at systems that are being used by herbivores, they can sometimes be net emitters more than more than the sequester. And so these things are so variable in naturally. And so the fundament of many of these things, these calculations, is a very shoddy science.
Shoddy science and shoddy knowledge. I'm thinking again, and Madhu, you've been doing a lot of work on grasslands. Again, we tend to think of the fact that carbon is above ground because we can see it. And so you can count it and you can measure it with these trees. And so you take grasslands, which we now know sequester so much carbon below the ground, destroy them and plant eucalyptus trees, saying we're actually doing carbon positive work.
Yeah, and I think the more fundamental perversion that's happening here is intellectually, it's an interesting idea that you can use carbon to symbolize something that's extremely complex. So in that way, simplification helps. But if you're ultimately going to do all your optimizations based on that very simple currency, you can go horribly wrong. And so you're commodifying something very, very complex. You're making it fungible. It can be this carbon. I mean, it's ultimately carbon. Whether you get it as grass or as tree,
Doesn't matter.
Or coral reefs.
Yeah. So if that becomes the lens through which you start seeing all of nature, then
I think, Madhu, you pointed out something really, really important, right? And I think that's where the violence, and I was calling it violence intentionally, that the abstraction of a current model of economics, which wants to reduce everything to its money value, which is, I think, really important to understand. And the push so the place that conservation is finding itself is in an arena which wants to reduce everything to a universal currency. So carbon is very attractive because carbon captures within it the entire idea that it can represent all these messy, diverse forms. The financial world does not want all this mess. That's why they like the idea of dollar, a money value, right? Everything. So you can put a money value on everything. I think fundamentally the bigger contradiction we're facing, and so I think we have to problematize and democratize the idea of markets. I think what has become really important, and I think for conservationists, it's very critical to problematize it this way, because you're responding to a particular kind of financialized, globalized markets. Whereas there are markets about it. There are markets for your honey in the local market. There are markets for, fabric. And human societies have dealt with markets a long time. I think it's Rajni Bakshi, I think, wrote this really interesting of looking at bazaars versus markets. I mean, more to sort of conceptualize and separate these semantic part, separate these institutional.
Who you're buying from,
who you're buying from.
It's not going to overextract.
Still embedded in place.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important that we get away, because the fundamental hubris is it's a reductionist hubris that we have, and that is what neoclassical economics aims to do, that there is universal values to which and that is really the money value. That it will capture everything of this infinite variety of things. And ecology doesn't work that way.
Ecology doesn't work that way. Food security doesn't work that way. I think the EU's, for instance, the entire EU push, which they then walked back a little bit, but which was to take away all this productive land, agricultural land, because you were doing carbon positive work, and to convert it into biofuel. And now we know the biofuel, if you really do the math of the carbon, it's not carbon positive. And on the other hand, what you're doing is taking a lot of good agriculturally viable land and removing it from food productivity.
It's that scale interested in only one thing, right? Increasing the level of accumulation of surplus value, increasing profit. So now you're asking that mechanism, which looks at abstract universal idea of profit, to suddenly say, you know what, it's not as profitable to extract things from a mine as to leave it just like that. There's a serious switch in imagination.
There's another universalizing thing here, which is that you talked about, just carbon. This is the fundamental problem that we need to address, and in the context of climate change. And on the one hand, of course, it seems to make sense that we measure how we are doing against climate targets and things like that just with this one measure of carbon. And so then, of course, when you do that, the market says, okay, if carbon is the problem, I'll find ways to solve it. And it takes you away from...
There was a very interesting letter I saw recently. There is the COP16 and the 23, the Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention on Climate Change are both happening, like the Conference of Parties are happening a couple of months apart. So there's a bunch of scientists who have written saying, I was trying to illustrate the pitfalls of trying to reduce something to carbon, and not just reduce it to carbon, but to make all decisions based on that very reduced conceptualization. When you do that, So they were essentially trying to say that there is a very deep integration between the biodiversity and the climate crisis. And today, a lot of climate mitigation action is undermining biodiversity conservation. You mentioned grasslands. So that you will destroy grasslands that are providing huge amounts of sequestration in order to avoid emission through putting vast fields of industrial scale renewable energy, or plant this over with eucalyptus or casuarina or what have you. That perversion, the way biodiversity is getting undermined in the pursuit of climate mitigation goals, that it bears saying is astonishing. That
you need to say it.
That two global conventions on which hundreds of countries have signed have not tried to fundamentally reconcile the trade-offs. And we are completely willing to go forward and forge forward with this idea of how to, reduce carbon emissions. When you ultimately do that, you get a very perverse outcome of undermining biodiversity in order to make
not just biodiversity, even food security. Very many lands are being converted into, these solar farms and all the rest of it, which are productive agricultural
one thing we
lands.
haven't talked about, which is also one of our threads running through this entire conversation series, is power and justice. And if you said protected areas had its implications on power and justice, causing deep injustices, and sustainable development was a way to fix them, I think markets have the capacity to affect the most perverse outcomes in terms of imbalance of power and therefore creating the deepest injustices, right? And that's something we're not recognizing in this entire debate about markets.
It's very
we're not talking about
interesting
justice.
how at a global scale, the common but differentiated responsibility is a very important concept. But that simply doesn't drill down into
the local scale.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Scales
Not
at all.
At all.
And definitely not at the...
in fact, you will talk about trade barriers, right? If you start talking about differentiated kind of things, you'll talk about trade barriers because you want a universal regime in which there is a smooth flow of services and goods all across the world. That's the wet dream of a growth-oriented economy.
Coming back to the fact that, like it or not, I think markets are not. We should have a world in an ideal system where economy is embedded in ecology, and in fact, it is embedded in ecology in the sense that when economy doesn't realize it's embedded in ecology, but in reality it is. However, it is still a world in which economy increasingly so is driving everything, and ecology or conservation is scrambling to sort of catch up. How do we take this forward?
I think that's where we should look at alternatives, and I think very important to understand that sometimes it is about quote-unquote crudely put picking sides. And I think sometimes I find it contradictory that conservation as a pursuit, as a science, it is true to itself, especially from what planetary science is telling us. Picking this side and saying hitching your wagons to a growth-oriented economy and not questioning it, while there are a whole bunch of other forms of conceptualizing the economy, which are also, which are much richer traditions, which incorporate ecology again. And I think that's where the role of knowledge plays a big role. Dominance for certain conceptualization of the planet and the human inside it through a certain set of lenses, which I would broadly call neoclassical economics, is very limiting. And I think it has had its, one doesn't want to diss everything. There have been tangible signs of progress that this kind of approach has made, but it's clearly hitting the limits.
But these kinds of reasoning can be ecologically sophisticated, but politically deeply naive. So
I think that's a very important core of it.
Yeah.
The political naivety.
My sense is that I don't know. The last couple of years have, because I study the effects of climate change, and the last couple of years have really shown me that we seem to be hitting some strong clarity about.
Have perhaps already, and maybe earlier than we ever expected
out of control. The discontinuities of the natural system are beginning to be, becoming very, very self-evident. And it's playing itself out in the ecological system, but it's playing out itself out in social
and also simple intellectual appeal. What I find amazing is we're talking about diversification of all kinds of ideas. That, it's a complex problem. We need to throw all that we have. Why is it that when it comes to the realm of the economy, that we trust in only one formula, one hegemonic set of ideas? So I think in the spirit of really expanding it and allowing other ideas to take a shot at goal, because this goal is getting closer and closer. You can't shift it out into the future. So I think really where ecologists and conservationists have to really work is in embedding themselves. And that's where I think alternatives. I really strongly feel that this whole idea that ecologists have and conservationists particularly, have drawn these boundaries and say that they are working within that, and they let larger economic wisdom emanate from the current, ideas of economy. I think, on the other hand, there could be a completely reimagined relationship where you are really sitting there together with and have a stake in reimagining the idea of the economy itself.
Which means that's
Which is Tansley, if you look at it historically, that is not unknown. Roger Tansley, who was the kind of father of the ecosystems idea, when they spoke of ecology and ecosystem science, they were actually talking about how ecosystem science can guide national fortunes. In that case, of course, the imperial fortunes. But nevertheless, I mean, there have been times during the 40s, 50s, when this idea of ecology as defining development, the whole idea of human ecology. So I think it's possible to reimagine that relationship.
So, I mean, we have a common root of the oikos. Huh? So how do we...
Exactly. Ecology, economy have the same word. Same word. I think that's absolutely.
How do you understand and how do you manage the home, so to speak? I would like to riff off Michael Sandel, who's talked about how, the market as a mechanism of economic allocation is makes a lot of sense. But today, I think as we talked about in the case of protected areas and sustainable development, if you produce it to a degree that is absurd, and I think the absurdity that I'm pointing to is that today we are trying to reorganize our ecology and our society around economy. So that is what he calls a market society. We have stopped being a market economy and we are becoming more of a market society. And that is a perversion that you would do well to avoid.
And it's so decontextualized of place that it completely takes us away. Yeah.
I think these critiques have existed of the unadulterated market, a capitalist kind of market, which is focused only on maximizing profit and the cumulative drive. And I think from Polanyi, Marx onwards, and I think there are many heterodox traditions within economics itself. And I think finding new alignments to, marry ecology and conservation science, if at all, the emerging ideas of conservation science, it makes tremendous sense.
Which are place-based. And I think that takes us to our last episode, which is on alternatives. So thank you for watching us so far. Just to quickly summarize, we started by setting the stage by talking about conservation, where it is at the crossroads and the different currents that come into conservation. We then looked at the three major issues of protected areas and the preservationist narrative. We looked at sustainable development and conservation. And finally, in this episode, we've looked at the contradictions of conservation market as a marketplace. Now let's, I think, look forward with what can we do from here. I think these have been critiques. We've also looked at opportunities, but the real opportunities lie in a lot of place-based alternatives. And so we'll talk about this a lot in the 5th episode. So we hope you'll join us. Thank you for staying with us so far and see you in the last episode.